All right. Good afternoon, everyone in Australia, New Zealand, and good morning to all my friends from Europe. And hello, wherever you are. Welcome to our Center for Environmental Law, Macquarie University's Biodiversity Law and Governance webinar series. So this month, we are very honored to welcome Professor Cliquet from Ghent University, which is also my alma mater in Belgium, to talk about the European Union's 2030 biodiversity. I think for most people know that the EU has been a leader in many environmental related fields, and last year the European Union adopted its new European Green Deal with focus on the kind of a recovery after the pandemic, and the 2030 biodiversity strategy is a very important part of it. And we are very, very lucky to have an international expert, Professor Cliquet, who has been specialized in the field of biodiversity law, both international, European, and domestic, for decades. And Anne was even my PhD thesis examiner, dates back to those good old days when I was in Ghent 10 years ago. So I will just stop here and give the floor to Anne. And once again, welcome everyone, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nanya, for the introduction. And good morning to everyone. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or I know for some people even good night. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here, and I think also the series that you're organizing is a wonderful idea. So I was asked to tell you something about the strategy, the new biodiversity strategy from the European Union. Now, before I start talking about the strategy, I first would like to talk about some things that happened before the strategy, because the strategy was adopted in May 2020. Now, first, I would like to explain a little bit about the legal framework, because we already have a legal framework on nature conservation way before we had the strategy in 2020. And we go way back in time. We already have EU nature conservation legislation since 1979, when we had the Birds Directive, our first binding law in Europe on nature conservation. And that was followed by another directive, 1992, the so-called Habitats Directive. Now, just I'm going to be very briefly for those who are not familiar with EU nature legislation, those two directives are really the core EU nature legislation. And what's their purpose? The purpose is to maintain or to restore habitats and species in a favorable conservation status. And how are they doing this? By using the two main nature conservation measures. On the one hand, through area protection, by establishing an ecological network of protected areas, which we call the Natura 2000 network. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have the strict species protection. Okay, so that's the core legislation. Now, it exists for a long time, and obviously we've got lots of literature and analysis of that legislation. And actually the overall view on the legislation is that these are solid pieces of legislation. And this was, amongst others, the conclusion that was drawn in a book that my colleague from UCL, Charles Born, and a couple of other colleagues edited a couple of years ago, based on a conference we organized with experts from all over Europe on the Habitats Directive. And the overall conclusion of the book was that the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive, they are Europe's nature best hope. So that was a very positive conclusion. It was also the conclusion of a so-called fitness check that European Commission ordered to see whether the two directives are still fit for purpose. And so there was a study done, and the Commission concluded, and the study concluded, that indeed the nature directives are fit for purpose. The problem, however, as we will see later on, is that state of nature is not so good, but the problem is not so much legislation in itself. The problem is the lack of implementation or insufficient implementation. So the European Commission came up with an action plan on the directives in 2017. And just very briefly, they came up with 4 priority areas and 15 concrete actions. And well, the priority areas, as you can see here, was improving guidance and knowledge, also building political ownership and strengthening compliance. And just to give you one example of one of the measures was that they want to further develop species and habitats action plans for the most threatened species and habitats, but also want to build stakeholder platforms on the coexistence with conflict species like large carnivores, like the brown bear, for instance, that we have in Europe. Other priority areas is strengthening the investment in Natura 2000 and also better communication. So these were a couple of priority, or the 4 priority areas. So that was for the legislation. Turning to the EU policy, the strategy we have now is not the first one. We had a strategy that came before that, that was concluded in 2011. And that again was a strategy from the European Commission, which was called Our Life Insurance, Our Natural Capital, Biodiversity Strategy to 2020. Now, this strategy has a headline target, and the headline target is to halt the loss of biodiversity and degradation of ecosystem services in the EU by 2020, and restoring them as far as feasible, while stepping up the contribution to averting global biodiversity loss. So that's the headline target. And then the strategy contains 6 targets and 20 actions. And here you could just see a brief overview of the 6 targets. So there was one target was on the protection of species and habitats. There was one which was very much in line with the CBD, with the IG targets, was to restore 15% of degraded ecosystems. We had a target on sustainable agriculture and forestry. We had one on sustainable fisheries. We had a target on invasive alien species, and also a target linking the global biodiversity loss. So these are our 6 targets, and so they were concluded in 2011. When we look at the impacts, there was a midterm review of that strategy in 2015, and as you can see here on the headline target, no significant progress was made towards targets. If we look at the different 6 targets, then what we see is that there is only one in which we were on track with implementing this, and that was the combat of invasive alien species. For the other ones, unfortunately, there was the one on sustainable agriculture and forestry, no significant progress, and then all the other ones, there was some progress, but not sufficiently. So actually not a very positive picture from the previous strategy. And that was 2015, but unfortunately, I'm afraid that this picture was confirmed in 2020, because in 2020, our latest State of Nature report came out. That's from the European Environmental Agency, in which they report on the state of nature within the EU based on the reporting done by the member states in the implementation of the nature directives. Now, one of the things they did in the report was look at 2 of the targets from the previous strategy. And as you can see here, the first target has not been reached. The first target, the whole idea was that the percentage of habitats that are in a favorable conservation status or have an improved status should rise by 100%. So that meant that actually 34% should be in a favorable conservation status or improved status. That target was not met. For species, also the target was to reach 35%, and for bird species, That aim was to reach 78%, but none of the targets were met. And also target 3 on sustainable agriculture, no real progress was made. So actually we see here a confirmation of already the midterm review in 2015. When we look overall at the status of species and habitats in the EU from the 2020 report that came out, we actually see that for the birds species that are already protected since 1979, we see that a little bit than half of the bird species that are assessed are in a favorable conservation status. And it's even a little bit a decline towards the previous assessment of a couple of years ago, where we still reached 52% of favorable conservation status. So now it's been reduced to 47. Now, if we look at the other species, then there the picture is absolutely worse. We see that only 27% is in a favorable conservation status, in a good conservation status. And when we look at trends, there we see that only 6% that's in an unfavorable status is improving. And I'm afraid that for the habitats, there the situation is still even worse. There we see that only 15% is in a favorable conservation status. And also here we see a decline with the previous assessment where we had 16%, so we even went down with 1%. And if we look also at the trends, also there we see that there is only 9%, I think, that is going in the wrong, it's going in the right direction. So we see even that a large percentage of habitats are even further deteriorating at 36%, and for the species 35%. So all in all, not a very positive result. And here is just a slide to show you what are the main the causes for biodiversity loss. Agriculture is probably one of the main dominant causes for biodiversity loss within the European Union. We've got obviously also urbanization, we've got invasive alien species, we've got forestry, we've got pollution, we've got illegal killing and hunting, we've got modification of water regimes, and obviously on top of all of that, we've got climate change. So when the report came out, the picture doesn't look good. So the report also gained media attention, as you can see here, from just a selection of media articles, be it in general newspapers, like The Guardian reported on it. And you see from the titles also NGOs, of course, reported on this. And you can see from the titles, the vast majority of Europeans' habitats are in a poor or even in a bad condition. We are reaching a tipping point. We show alarming figures. Time is up, and it's a wake-up call for policy makers. And that wake-up call for policy makers indeed woke up, at least at the EU level, at the Commission level, was a wake-up call, and we see it reflected in the biodiversity strategy. So, and that's what I want to talk about now for the large part of this presentation. So the biodiversity strategy of 2030. Now, I have to mention that this strategy does not stand on its own. It's part of the European Green Deal. Since the new Commission came in office, they put the environment and climate really as their top priority, a bit opposed to the previous European Commission, where this was absolutely not a priority. And so the European Green Deal is really their main policy area. And as you can see here from this tree of the Green Deal, the biodiversity strategy here is just one of the leaves of the tree. There are many other things that are also part of this Green Deal. For instance, here you can see there will be a European climate law, but many more things will happen in this Green Deal. Now, if we look at the strategy itself, you can see that the title is Bringing Nature Back into Our Lives. And the strategy, of course, it came out in May 2020, when we were already in the middle of the COVID crisis. And the COVID crisis, I think, was to a certain extent a source of inspiration also for this strategy. It certainly influenced it because the COVID crisis, on the one hand, the cause for the COVID crisis is because of our interference in nature. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we see that people really depend on it and really started to appreciate nature more, especially people, I guess that everybody has been to a certain extent been in lockdown for the past year. And you saw that people were going back to enjoy nature, to walk in nature. Our nature reserves here in Belgium were just, crowded with people. People going out. We saw with lockdown cities, species coming back into cities that we've lost before. So I think that the awareness of the importance of nature just increased a lot in the past year. And the strategy actually starts to explain why do we need to protect biodiversity, and it explains the fact that it's essential for our lives, but also it relates to the climate crisis. And the way that biodiversity can contribute to mitigation and adaptation of climate change. But it also, of course, points to the loss of biodiversity and the loss of nature that we are facing. So that's basically the introduction of the biodiversity strategy. Another element that they are stressing within the strategy is it's not just about some species and the birds and flowers. It also has a very big economic value, and they stress this also through this leaflet. More than half of global GDP depends on nature. So biodiversity, which I think is not known to many people, has such an important economic value as well and creates so many benefits. And we often hear politicians say that, well, we don't have money to spend on nature conservation policies, but some very good scientific research points to the fact that not doing something against biodiversity loss or against climate change is going to cost us much more. So the cost of inaction, both economically and socially, is so much bigger. There was also studies being done and that could be helpful also in the recovery post-COVID, is that nature conservation can create jobs, and that really points to it also within the EU. This really creates huge opportunities. So this is also something that the European Commission is really stressing in their strategy, in the introduction to their strategy. So, but then about the strategy itself, as you can see here, this is a document. It was adopted 20 May of 2020. So it's a communication from the Commission to the Parliament and the Council and the other committees. And this is just one step of the process. What happens next is that it was already adopted as conclusions by the Council of EU Ministers. So they endorsed the strategy, and it's also part of the process within the European Parliament, where we already have a draft report that came out in December of 2020. And in the Environmental Committee of the Parliament, they are working on the final report now. It should come out any day now in March, and it's coming for the plenary session in the European Parliament in April of this year. Okay, and then let's have a look at what's in the strategy itself. By now you should all say, oh, what a cute animal. It's just to check whether you're still awake or not. Okay. There are three main chapters in this strategy, but the first one actually contains two important parts. So I've got 4 parts which I want to explain you about. So the first one is about protecting and restoring nature in the EU. On the one hand, through nature protection, on the second hand, by restoration. Now, to do all this, you need also enable this change that we need. And then the last part is about the relationship with the global biodiversity agenda. So what I would like to do is to go all over this. It will be very briefly. The document itself is more than 20 pages. There are many actions in it. So I'll just go over them, just very briefly on all of them. So first of all, we've got nature protection in the strategy, and we need obviously more protected nature, which will be beneficial for the environment, of course, but also for the economy. And again, they stress there that it will be important for the recovery after COVID. Now, what are the key commitments? The key commitments is to protect at least 30% of land, and to protect at least 30% of the sea, and also to connect the protected areas through ecological corridors. Now, of those protected areas, the target now is that at least 1/3 should be strictly protected. So that means that 10% of both land and 10% of sea should be strictly protected. And also, it's not just enough to establish protected areas. We also need to have clear conservation objectives and measures for all the protected areas. I just want to say a little bit more on those targets, because they are really, I think they're really important. And how far are we from reaching those targets? Well, if we look for land, within the EU, we already have 26% protected area from the terrestrial environment. So there, I think distance to target is feasible. 26%, that means that it's both covered by EU legislation or national legislation. For the marine environment, we have 11% protected, so their distance to target is still quite a long way to go. However, if we look at strict protected areas there, which the aim is to have 10% protected, there we see that only 3% of the land and only 1% of the marine environment is strictly protected. So there will be a large way to go. The strategy also mentioned that within those strictly protected areas, all remaining primary and old growth forests should be protected strictly, but also other significant areas, especially those that are carbon-rich ecosystems like peatlands, wetlands, marine ecosystems, and so on. It's also important to mention that this target, or these targets, 30%, 10%, they relate to the EU as a whole. So maybe not every state will have to protect 30%, but overall the 30% and 10% should be reached. And obviously every member state will have to contribute to this target, and they will all have to contribute by designating new protected areas and also to establish ecological corridors. I think very important here is that, because this is a policy in the strategy, is that the Commission will, after a short while, assess if new legislation will be needed. And I think that's good, because otherwise we fear, or we might face that within another 10 years, we will say, well, we had the targets in 2020 and we didn't reach them, like we had the targets before that we didn't reach. So the fact that they will look if they need binding legislation, I think that's a very important element. Okay, then let's have a look at the next item, which is actually the biggest part of the strategy, and that's the focus of restoration. And I think that's very important. You saw what the state of nature is. We see that large parts of nature in Europe are degraded, are not in a favorable conservation status. So it's really now the idea to improve the status, to restore nature in Europe as in a favorable or more favorable conservation status. So there are quite a lot of commitments under this chapter in the strategy, and actually we need to do more restoration. We need a bigger boat. So that's the first commitment. And very important here is that the strategy itself does not say we need to protect 15 or we need to restore 15% or whatever, but they say we are going to need legally binding targets on restoration. And that restoration law is going to be proposed in 2021. I'm going to elaborate a little bit later on that as well. So we will also need to restore, it will be about restoration of degraded, but also carbon-rich ecosystems. Also very important is that we need no deterioration in the conservation status and trends of protected habitats and species. And at least 30% of protected habitats and species that are currently not in a favorable conservation status need to reach this favorable conservations, or at least have a strong positive trend. So on top of the ones that are now already in a favorable conservation status, we need an additional 30% that will become in a favorable or improved status. Obviously, the fact that you need to reach a favorable conservation status is already a legally binding obligation under the Birds and Habitats Directive. However, those directives do not include a concrete time frame. Now we've got the advantage that we have a concrete time frame. On the other hand, the question is, of course, if this is already soon enough. And there, I think the answer is clearly no. I think we have here the deficit of a lack of implementation of the directives, because we should already have reached a favorable or at least an improved status for many of the protected species and habitats. So that shows again that there was a lack of legislation lack of implementation of the legislation. So also important is that the strategy pays attention for agricultural lands. As I showed you, one of the main factors for biodiversity loss within the EU is because of agriculture. And there's not just that, we also have another strategy that was improved in 2020, that's the farm to fork strategy. And obviously we also have our common agricultural policy. Now, in the biodiversity strategy, some of the elements that relate to agricultural lands is that we should reverse the decline in pollinators, because that's very important, of course. There should be a reduction of use of chemical pesticides by 50%. At least 10% of agricultural land should be under high diversity landscape features, meaning hedges, tree, ponds, and so on. And 25% of agricultural land should be under organic farming management. It's a bit of pity that the target for 10% high diversity landscape features is not included in the farm to fork strategy or in the common agricultural policy, whereas this is, I think, a very important goal that we should reach, and also something that's missing in this strategy, but also in the farm to fork strategy, or maybe not strong enough, is the issue of meat overproduction and overconsumption, which is not properly addressed, and which is still one of the most important causes, for instance, of nitrogen deposition, like countries in Belgium and the Netherlands. Okay, the strategy also pays attention, next to agricultural lands, also to some other ecosystems, for instance, for forests. The goal is to plant at least 3 billion trees. That will be part of a new EU forest strategy that still needs to be worked out. For freshwater ecosystems, we have a concrete target of having at least 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers to be restored. For marine ecosystems, we've got a whole bunch of targets. There needs to be a new action plan to conserve fishery resources and protect marine ecosystems. Negative impact through fishing should be reduced. We need to eliminate to reduce bycatch. And also there should be fishery management measures in each MPA. And then finally, a bit different ecosystem are urban areas, where the target is that cities with at least 20,000 inhabitants should have an ambitious urban greening plan. Okay. Some other commitments that we have is that we need to do a lot about degradation of soil and to restore it, including remediation of contaminated soil sites. We need to reduce pollution. There are a lot of measures there, but one is that we should reduce nutrient loss with at least 50%, resulting in reduction of fertilizers by at least 20%. And also, we should continue our struggle against invasive species, and the number of red list species that are threatened by invasive species should be reduced by 50%. Okay, so these were the two main items, protection and restoration. And how are they going to do it? And we need to enable this. And enabling this means that they're thinking about a new governance framework, which includes monitoring and review mechanism that they want to set up, also including a clear set of indicators so they can measure what they put forward in the strategy. And I think also important here is again that the Commission will assess whether or not they will need a legally binding framework on governance. We already have such a governance regulation on climate change and energy policy. So they will assess if they need something like this as well for biodiversity. Also, they will need to do something about implementation and enforcement of EU legislation. This will be about all EU environmental legislation, but specifically also for the Birds and the Habitats Directive. They want to complete the Natura 2000 network, they want to focus on species protection, and so on. Also, they want to improve compliance assurance. They don't say completely how they're going to do it, but at least also they put it in the strategy. And also they want to do something about access to justice and even improve it. That relates to the Aarhus Convention and its implementation within the EU. Okay, they also want to do something about what they call a whole of society approach, including measures of improving the knowledge, education and skills. They already launched a new knowledge center for biodiversity in 2020. The strategy also contains some other measures on education and improving the knowledge. Also, they mentioned the business for biodiversity. They want to take an initiative on sustainable corporate governance. And then for me, what's very crucial within the strategy is also the money that we need to do for restoration and for conservation. And here they come up with a figure of at least 20 billion euros per year for nature, which should come from both public and private funding, both national and EU level. And also from the EU climate budget, at least 25% should go to biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Within the Council conclusions, they even mentioned 30% of the climate budget. Okay, and so they will also continue to work on a natural capital accounting initiative. The last part of the strategy is aimed at the contribution of the EU to the global biodiversity agenda. And well, as you probably all know, also here we can see similar picture of the progress of the RG biodiversity targets that were concluded in 2010. Also here we see that certainly not enough progress has been made. If you look at this dashboard, you see that only a little bit is in green, but most of it, there has been only some progress, but certainly not sufficient or even no progress at all, which shows from the Global Biodiversity Outlook number 5. As you probably also know, we are in the preparation of a post-2020 biodiversity framework under the Biodiversity Convention, which actually should have been concluded already in 2020, but because of COVID has been postponed first to May of this year, but again been postponed to October of 2021. And well, there has already been a call both from scientists, but also, for instance, from the European Parliament that we should need at the global level binding targets on biodiversity protection and restoration, and calling for sort of parallel to the Paris Agreement on climate change. We should need a Paris Agreement on biodiversity. So turning back to the strategy of the EU, it's the commitment of the EU to lead the efforts for an ambitious post-2020 biodiversity framework within the CBD. And they list a couple of minimum elements in the framework. The target there should be that by 2050, all ecosystems are restored, resilient, and adequately protected. But in the meanwhile, we should have ambitious targets for 2030. We should also be able to measure them. So we again have to need mechanisms for implementation, for monitoring, but also for reviewing, and have a whole cycle in this with possibly something like a ratchet mechanism that if after reviewing it, we're not going to reach the targets, that we scale up our commitments, a bit similar as to what we have in the Paris Climate Agreement. We should have an enabling framework, meaning that we should have the financial support, we should have the research, and so on. And also they stress the importance of participation of stakeholders. Now, this is just one element and the contribution to what's going to happen under the CBT. Apart from that, the EU strategy also gives a couple of elements where they also want to contribute in other fields or in other frameworks or other treaties where they want to contribute to. And for instance, for ocean governments, they firmly want to support the new binding agreement on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. They support the designation of 3 additional marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean. They support zero tolerance for IUU fishing, so illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. They also want to do something about harmful fishery subsidies, and they want to work through the World Trade Organization and to come up with a global agreement to ban these harmful subsidies. And with regards to deep sea mining, they want to apply the precautionary principle. On trade policy, there we see that they refer to trade agreements where they want to have full implementation of the biodiversity provisions in trade agreements, in the existing ones. And also they want to strengthen biodiversity provisions in new agreements. Something we don't have in the strategy is that they want, or at least they don't mention it, is that they would renegotiate existing trade agreements, like for instance the Mercosur agreement. And I think that's maybe a little bit a disappointment that they didn't put this in the strategy. Also, they want to work on illegal wildlife trade, which again, I think is amongst others important also with regards to the transfer of zoonotic diseases. Also, they want to tighten the rules on ivory trade. And then with regards to international cooperation, they want to continue financial support to developing countries for biodiversity protection. Again, they relate to biodiversity and human health by supporting the One Health approach. And they also want to strengthen the link between biodiversity protection and human rights. I'm nearly there, just my last part, which I just would like to focus on the new legislation. As I mentioned a couple of times in the strategy, they mentioned the idea of at least assessing whether or not there should be new legislation, but at least for one, they have a firm commitment, and that's with regards to the new restoration law. Now, this is in the process of being developed by the European Union, by the Commission. You can go to their website and there you see that they've got a timeline. They are now in the process of consulting with stakeholders. And so that's what they are doing. And obviously, stakeholders are, for instance, environmental NGOs, and they already sort of prepared a positioning paper on what they think that should be included in that new EU restoration law. They also have a petition going around for citizens to support this idea of the law, and also to mention what kind of ideas should be there for the law. And I just would like to elaborate very briefly on the ideas for this new law. The Commission will propose a law which have to include binding targets for restoration. And just to give you a couple of ideas, the State of Nature report comes up with a figure of, but that's only for those habitats that are protected in the EU, that because of their unfavorable conservation status, 5% of EU territory, only of the protected areas under the Habitats Directive, needs to be restored or recreated. Now, obviously, that's not talking about other habitats outside of the Habitats Directive. We will need to do much more. And there we see that there are a couple of figures. The Parliament, but I have to stress it is only in the draft report, even talks of a target of at least 30% that should be restored, and also that we need ecosystem-specific targets. When we look at the NGOs, several NGOs, we see that they put forward a target of 15%, the one that we already had in the previous target that was by no means met. And that should both count for land and sea. And also that should be done in each member state. So here, no effort sharing. Every member state should restore at least 15%. They also stress the importance of restoring certain ecosystems like peatlands, wetlands, forests, but not agricultural lands, because they say there this should fall under the common agricultural policy and also should be paid by funding that's coming from that policy. Now, obviously, the restoration obligation should be on additional to what we already have as obligations in, for instance, the Birds and Habitats Directives, but also the Water Framework Directive, for instance. They should aim to restore high quality nature, but also not just the core areas, but also connectivity and also natural processes. We need national restoration plans with quantitative targets. Restoration should both be active and passive, both within and outside protected areas. We need clear deadlines, monitoring, and also we need to create a restoration fund. A couple of my own considerations on that new law. I think it will be very important to define what restoration is, or at least to provide possibilities for several forms of restoration, because not every greening will be a full restoration. So that's important. Also, it will be important to set the baselines, to work with reference ecosystems, to be very ambitious. And for me, that would mean that they would work with standards that we already have at the international level for the Society of Ecological Restoration, for instance, that we could translate those at the EU level. Also that it should be science-based, we have to monitor, and there are questions, of course, we need to translate them at the national level, and there we will probably be confronted with a lot of issues that we still haven't solved yet. There would be all kinds of legal barriers relating to property rights, land use planning instruments, conflicting laws, and so on. So we're certainly not there yet. And obviously enforcement and financing, I think, is also crucial. So some concluding thoughts. The strategy. If you look at the strategy, I think it's very comprehensive. There are lots of measures in there, not always very specific. So a lot more work needs to be done. For me, it's important that there are a number of elements where they maybe will have some legal initiatives, and obviously the new restoration law is a very important one in that regard. But the strategy is a policy, so it will not be enough. We need implementation, enforcement, financial support, but also what I think is very important is coherence with sectoral policies like the agricultural policy. That will be crucial. And relating to the global area, I think that the EU, with its new strategy, can fulfill the role of a frontrunner for the global commitments and obligations. So that was my presentation, and I want to end up with a picture of a bird that is daily a visitor in my garden. So thanks for listening, and I'm open to questions.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for your highly interesting presentation. I particularly love all those pictures, and each side has a very interesting picture. I think that really kind of wakes everyone up if they are still kind of in a kind of sleepy time zone. And so now we have about 15 minutes, 18 minutes, 17 minutes. So the floor is open. Anyone who has any question to Anne can raise your hand and then speak. Or if you want to put your question in the chat box, that's also fine. And we can read it out and then I could answer. Okay, yeah, please go ahead. Anyone has any questions?
I see Volker raised his hand.
Okay, Volker, the floor is yours. Where is he?
Okay, thank you, Anne. Wonderful overview. Very short, yes, very nice pictures. And can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So, yeah, you showed very well, I think, that the EU is currently quite concentrating on something like active restoration, so restore somehow the biocapacity, while the bringing down the consumption and production level, our ecological footprint, yeah, that's something different. And I just wonder, because you showed also that the EU has mentioned this 10% of agricultural land should be have a high diversity landscape elements and so on. And that was actually in there till 2008, actually the agricultural policy, yeah, with 10% set aside in the EU. And 2008, when the food prices went up, just overnight in the Agricultural Minister Council, this 10% were deleted, yeah. And now we are going back, at least on the nature conservation side, to those 10%, but you pointed out rightly that the agricultural side and the farm to fork policy didn't include it, yeah. So are we ambitious enough really with nature conservation? Should we do more than we have done in the past? And what could we do more on the preventive maintenance against production and consumption within nature conservation law, instead of concentrating just on this active restoration? Yeah, what can we do really against this additional production and consumption?
Well, I mentioned it. I think one of the crucial elements that we miss in the farm to fork strategy and also in the biodiversity strategy is the overproduction of meat. We've got serious issues, and just one element is the serious issues with the impact of live cattle in the EU. But I think that even though they didn't really include it, I think we will be forced to do something about it, because if we look at the rulings by the European Court of Justice, we see that the policies that were put forward, for instance, in the Netherlands, were not accepted, and the Netherlands really now is facing the obligation to really tackle this, and they've been trying to avoid this for a long time. They've been coming up with all kinds of policies, but that was not sufficient, and now they're obliged to do it. And recently in Flanders, at least, we had a national court case that also tackles this issue of nutrient deposition, which is detrimental for many of our nature reserves. And without tackling the overproduction, we will not get there. So, but of course, it's very sensitive for farmers and so on to do this. But that's one of the areas where they will need to take steps, or we will simply not reach the targets again.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. I think Afshin has raised his hand. Afshin.
Afshin, your mic is off.
Hi, Anne. Nice to see you.
Hi, Afshin. Nice to see you.
Thank you for that presentation, Anne. As usual, your slides are just magnificent and so well put together. So thank you for that. And just going back to some of the comments you made about restoration. Sorry, I've just taken myself off video. Just so I can come across. Just going back to your comments about restoration, and in Australia, we recently did a review of one of our most important environment legislation. And when it came to restoration, the report said that they wanted to target restoration so that we can achieve more sustainability in Australia. So the question I guess I have for you is, what's the point of restoration in this EU strategy? Is it to get private actors more engaged in nature conservation work? Is it to achieve sustainability? Is it to build protected areas? Is there a sense of the fact that there's something rather simple but yet magnificent in that strategy around restoration? I ask because I find the Australian approach to sustainability still attaches restoration to a kind of capital.
Well, I think
they a desire to be able to continue with development.
I think they obviously it's a biodiversity strategy, so obviously it's to restore biodiversity, but I think they put it in a broader context, and they see it is part of their sustainability policy as well. So I think it's not only for the environment, it's also for economic reasons, but it's also for the benefits that biodiversity, that nature has for EU citizens. They also mention participation and so on. So they want to really, engage also people in nature conservation and so on. So I think it's not just one element. I think it's a combination of reasons why they want to restore it. But I'm not sure that answers your question.
I think it does, Anne, and I guess where it started off, my query was the EU is really good at targets, and I guess I was trying to figure out the impact that those targets would have, and whether it's collaboration with private actors and networks, or whether it's on public and protected land, because that all then determines the overall strategy behind the restoration initiatives.
Yeah.
Just because I know you really well, and I wasn't going to ask you an easy question, so just
no, it's fine. No,
Thank
but
you.
also if you look at also if you look at funding, they clearly mentioned that the funding should come both from public and private partners. So it's not something that they see that they will do purely on public lands with public funding. They see it much broader than that. So they also want to involve the business. They also want to involve private citizens. So it's just not something only public. It's really broadened up in that regard.
But we still have about 10 minutes. Any further question from the audience? Oh, Walker, okay, you again.
If nobody else wants, but I saw somebody had his hand up also, the blonde lady down on the screen. Okay.
No. Yeah.
What I see in restoration is it contributes to GDP, because something actively has to be done again. Yeah, maintenance and no use or reduced use doesn't contribute to the GDP, so that's an economic advantage of restoration somehow. And another issue is the EU is good in setting targets, but it didn't really, as Anne showed, implement targets, also not during the past 10 years. Yeah. So the issue is really implementation, such as Braulio Diaz mentioned in his priorities when he was CPD Secretary General. And these targets also plus 3 million trees, yeah, what does it mean? It can even contribute to more needs for restoration, because if you put the wrong trees in the wrong area, then you have a restoration case again in the soil and everywhere. So these quantitative goals, 26% up to 30%, it doesn't guarantee that we are not creating any more paper parks. We have already quite many paper parks in the European Union. So I just wonder what would be really effective implementation targets. Do you have any hints on that? Thank you.
I fully agree with you, Volker. I was thinking about the same things when Afshan was saying you're good at having targets in the EU. We're very good, but we're not good at reaching the targets. So you're quite right. And I think we're certainly not there yet. I think a lot will depend on how they're going to make the EU restoration law. We should have binding targets, but I see very often that even if we've got other binding targets, that governments tend to to set minimum baselines, for instance. And so then they can say we reach the targets, but actually when you look on the ground, the situation does not improve, because of course, if you put your reference, your baseline very low, then you very easily reach your targets. Oh, we restored it, but the measures are just not good enough. And that's why I think that high ambition levels are important, but also standards on how to reach restoration. You've got things like in the standards of SCR, you've got recovery wheels, you've got the restoration as a continuum process. So you've got lots of instruments already available, and of course you will have to make sure that there are monitoring obligations and review mechanisms in your legislation, so that more frequently that we now have, and maybe some form of independent control or whatever, but we have to think about mechanisms to make sure that we've got an implementation on that. We cannot keep continuing to say we've got targets and after 10 years, well, we didn't reach the targets. I'm so tired of telling my students that, that we had the targets and we didn't get them, and then and we move on like this. So I think now it's really an issue of making this more concrete, more binding, and I think certainly from DG Environment in the European Commission, that they're really enthusiastic and willing to do something. But like you mentioned, also we need to do something on the other side as well. We need to involve also the agricultural sectors and so on. And if we can't do it voluntarily, then we'll think we have to keep on going to court and forcing court rulings that will oblige governments to do something. So that will also be the enforcement part, I think, will be very important. And I think, again, also the Commission can play a role there by bringing member states to the European Court of Justice.
So, and there are two very good questions from our students in the chat box. The first one is from Elizabeth Cox. I love the concept of restoration, and I agree that it would need to be properly defined. Would you say that this imposes a higher standard than the usual rehabilitation requirements, for example, in the post-mining operations?
I'm just reading it again. Yes, absolutely. I think there are lots of definitions in restoration, and I think the difference is made between rehabilitation in post-mining operations, for instance, and the real restoration, because the real restoration, I think in post-mining operations, you have to such an extent a degraded environment that you can never have a fully restored. You can have something that resembles a reference ecosystem, but it will probably never be the same as, for instance, restoring an old or full-grown forest or certain wetlands or peatlands, for instance, that take years to recover. So I think you have to make this distinction, and I think that you should enable not only the restoration of intact ecosystems, but also to allow for rehabilitation in post-mining situations. So I think you need to have all of that, and I think you also should maybe need something like greening of cities that would also maybe fall under a broad scope of restoration, but it's maybe not the full restoration, and I think there, but I didn't show it, but there again we've got scientific publications and reports and standards that show us the different levels of restoration you can have. So every improvement is good, but we certainly need in our protected areas, we need to have the full restoration and really trying to reach this reference ecosystem level and really high ambition for that.
Yeah, so the last question is from Mugada. How do you intend to engage the universities, researchers, NGOs in the action plan? I mean, I guess here you means the European Union, not you personally. Yeah, that's really the last question, man.
Well, I think that at the level of the Commission, they have a lot of cooperation with NGOs. They have regular, they have workshops and so on. So with NGOs, I think that's really part of their policies in order to correspond with them. But I also think, for instance, with universities and researchers, they work together in either formal formats or sometimes informal formats. I can just give one example. No, that was before the COVID crisis. So it might have been a year and a half ago, something like that. The Commission invited some biodiversity lawyers from the EU, from different countries, just to have a brainstorm day, just to listen to ideas of what we thought was important from a legal perspective. So they engage with people. They are active in that regard. So I think it's It's already there. It can be improved, of course, but I think we already have a lot of ways of engaging with the European Commission in that regard.
Yes. Okay. Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for participating in this interesting, highly interesting webinar. And thank you, Anne, for your time and for your very engaging talk. And please follow our Twitter. Everything will be there, and at least also will be recorded. And so I just want to say bye-bye to everyone, and see you next month in our webinar series. Thank you, Anne. Once again, thank you.
Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.